Welcome to the Writer's Dream. It's time for authors to tell us about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on Facebook. Just look for the Writer's Dream. We are also on YouTube. Look for the Writer's Dream, or look for me, Linda Maria Frank. I am the author of Annie Tillery Mysteries. A new one just came out called The Mystery of the Lost Avenger. If you have a question for the Writer's Dream or you'd like to appear on the Writer's Dream, please contact me through the messages on the Facebook page for the Writer's Dream. Today's guest is James A. Perez. He is an educator, a psychologist, a member of Long Island Authors, right? Long Island Authors and Illustrators. We'll get into that. Anyway, and he's written two really great books. One is Maya and Icarus, which is like a journey myth almost. And we'll talk about that. And Grandpa's Walking Stick. So welcome, James.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. So tell us about your books.
Sure. Well, as I said, there's two books that are out currently, with the sequel to Maya and Icarus out very soon. And they're different in that Maya and Icarus is a middle grade, young adult fantasy adventure book. And as you mentioned about a journey, it's based on the classic hero's journey, except it was very important to me to write a heroine's journey. So when I decided to write this book, it was very important that I have a strong female character as the lead. So I always say it's the heroine's journey. And you know as well about writing strong female
It's hopefully the year of the female's journey. Mm-hmm. We will say no more.
Right. Well, I will say about that, it's interesting when people talk about the hero's journey, they talk about Harry Potter, or they talk about Percy Jackson, and it's a boy, and it's with a strong female along for the ride. Most of the female protagonists it's post-apocalyptic, it's the Hunger Games, it's Divergent. It's very rare that you have a classic hero's journey where the lead character is a girl. So that was important to me.
Yes, but the classic hero's journeys almost always are heavily influenced by the female characters they come across, which is sort of like the history of the world.
Right.
So now it's our turn.
Right.
To mess things up.
The woman turns the head. You know, the man can be the head, but the woman turns the turns the neck. Right.
So tell me how your role as an educator. In fact, your role as an educator. Why don't you explain that first? Tell us what you do as an educator and a psychologist.
Well, I've been working in the public schools now for over 20 years. It's funny to be able to say over 20 years because for a long time I was only 20 years old. But started off as a classroom teacher. I taught 6th grade. From there, I was a guidance counselor for several years. While I was working in the classroom, I realized that I was better suited to the counseling aspect or the small group aspect. I wasn't really a fan of the classroom management or the aspect of it. And after doing that for several years, I went back and I have a degree in psychology. So from becoming guidance counselor for the last 11 years, I've been working as a school psychologist in an elementary school. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Adelphi. So
what do you
I have.
teach there?
I was teaching the history of psychology a couple of years back. It's been a couple of years. I've taken some time off since my daughter was born. She's 2. So I really know all the levels, all the way from elementary, all the way up to college, in terms of being an educator in different forms. And in terms of writing, it's interesting because a lot of people say, how did you know how to write about a teenage girl? And I was like, I don't know.
You've been speaking to teenage girls.
Yeah, in one form or another, close friends, the children of close friends who I base certain aspects of the character on. But in terms of how that influenced my writing, I try to make my writing fun. I try to make my writing just something that I think will be enjoyable, and that's not the best word, enjoyable, but just
engaging.
Engaging. Do you know what I mean? Knowing what brings out the best in kids. That was important to me, that the story be fun and engaging, but also inspirational, and also just about how, and this again goes back to the hero's journey, how someone ordinary can really persevere in extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah, I think being an educator is a wonderful jumping off point for someone who writes for anywhere, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school, because you have an idea of how they think, how the students think, how the kids think, and you also understand, because school is a microcosm of society, you understand what their needs are and what they, that I believe, and that's why I wrote my series. One of the reasons why I wrote my series was because I really felt that they needed inspiration. They needed to know how they fit fit into society, and they also have a need to learn about history and myth and journeys and all of this marvelous cultural background we have that somehow or other they aren't always connected with. And so that was my inspiration. But writing, how did you learn how to write?
Well, writing's always been a part of my job and careers. But really, it wasn't until I decided in the summer of 2007 to actually try writing that I wrote something that was fiction, and that I mentioned the summer of 2007 just because it was an interesting summer in that I was finishing up studying for the licensing exam to be a psychologist, and I had spent the year before that writing a dissertation, which was all-consuming. Finished the dissertation, then guess what? Now you have to take this exam that's going to knock your socks off. So I spent about 6 months studying for that exam. Summer 2007, I finished studying for the exam. Dissertation is long done. I suddenly had free time. The last Harry Potter book comes out. Like a good Harry Potter fan, I went to the book review at midnight in Huntington, where I live, waited for the book, read it in about 24 hours, and then I was like, wow, like it's over. And I was like, now what am I going to read? Because I've never really been a fan of young adult or middle grade fiction, but there was something about the Harry Potter books that I really enjoyed. And that's when I said, why don't you give it a shot? You know, I've written tons in terms of things for work, lesson plans, reports, the dissertation, which was 200 pages. So why not try to do something creatively? And the idea started to come together. And it was, and continues to be, you know, a work in progress. I mean, I think my writing in the sequel to Maya and Icarus is much better than in the writing in Maya and Icarus. But I also think that there's still a tremendous amount that I can learn. I don't know if any writer, I've met a writer that has said that they think that they have perfected the art of writing. I think it just is a...
Really?
I don't know. There's a couple of people in our organization who, you know, their egos seem such that they may say that.
Oh, yes. Well, it's amazing how our pathway to writing books is paralleled, because I hated to write when I was a kid, just hated it. But then when you become a teacher, you end up, if you're in any way creative, you really end up having to write lesson plans. And those lesson plans, if they're engaging, need to have stories. Yeah. At least that's what I found. All of I taught science. I mean, if you teach social studies, I imagine the stories are there. But with science, well, science, the stories are there too. But that's pretty much what engages people in your subject. I just did a lecture with the men's club. I find this story amusing. And it was on the Lindbergh kidnapping. I do a series of lectures on famous forensics cases. And it was the Lindbergh kidnapping. And I am attempting to explain to them the intricacies of how the ladder in the Lindbergh kidnapping was analyzed. And these men are all on their smartphones looking up Lindbergh's personal life and how many illegitimate children he had and blah, blah, blah. I just thought that was so funny, but really the point is that people are interested in the human aspect. And so actually that's how I got into writing books, is I thought to myself, okay, I can write a lesson plan, and then I always put this little background stuff, and I was beginning to have real fun writing about Isaac Newton, and I had him inventing the fig Newton, and a lot of fiction. So I think there's got to be that little seed in you that likes to talk about something other than, you know, just the things that you teach. You like to give background.
Right. Well, it's very interesting you say that, because it reminds me of the first class I ever taught as an adjunct professor, and it was a graduate psychology course on the history of psychological testing. So I'm talking about Binet and Try. And I will tell you, I fully admit the first class was a disaster. And I left there and I was just like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? So in preparing for the next class, for a class that was an hour and 50 minutes, I probably prepared about 15 hours that weekend before. And what I found made the difference in that second class is that I was injecting stories. And I was injecting, you know, we may have been talking about some really minuscule, important, you know, minuscule test, but I was injecting about my own experience working with a kid and working with his parent and talking about this and talking about this. And about halfway through the class, I realized that the students are laughing. and they're fully engaged. And I'm like, thank God, because the material was as dry as a
Yeah.
bone.
Yeah.
But without that, and it is similar to writing in that when you see, not necessarily that an audience is reacting, because you don't have an audience until much later, but when you see a spark, when an idea is able to just kind of grow, and you yourself are entertained by the idea. I'm not saying I'm entertained by my own writing, but like the idea intrigues me enough to want to explore it, to turn it into a book, to turn it into 2 books. It's that, like you said, it's that creativity we find within ourselves.
I also think it's the drive to share.
Yeah.
To share a story that you think is really, I don't so much look at myself as a writer as I do a storyteller. I love to tell a story, whether I made it up or it's, you know, a story that's true. I just really like telling a story. So how did you make the transition from writing lesson plans and dissertations to writing dialogue? People tell me that's daunting.
The dialogue.
Yeah.
I actually like writing the dialogue.
Too.
I really do. And I find in the sequel to Maya and Icarus, which is called Maya and Hippolyta, because I only write
Maya and
Hippolyta. I was going to say because I only write book titles that are tongue twisters.
good.
But the main character Maya is based on, it's actually my niece Maya, is based on her and another friend's daughter. The second character in the title is always a character from Greek mythology. So Icarus was the character for the first book. Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, is the supporting character in the second book. But when I was writing the second book, I found that I was writing a lot more dialogue than I did in the first book. And I found that I was having fun with the dialogue. And even if the dialogue, not that it didn't, I'm always aware of exposition in dialogue. You know, I'm always aware of that character. And Harry Potter, at least in the movies, is guilty of that. There's always a character that says, oh, I know what that is, and then like gives you a whole dissertation on something. I wanted the dialogue to be fun. I wanted it to be like snappy. I wanted it to be, you know, the character ages from 13 in the first book to 16 in the second book. And in writing the character of Hippolyta, I especially wanted their exchanges to just have like an energy to them. And I really, for lack of a better term, got into it. And so the dialogue for me has never been the issue. The issue for me has always been, you know, when they always say, show, don't tell. You know, and sometimes I feel you can go overboard with that, where you're showing every little, like everything just comes down to an analogy and a metaphor and a simile. And sometimes I'm like, let's just get to it, you know, and that's where I think I rely more on the dialogue. And the dialogue becomes, again, not just exposition, but just kind of like what I would hope is an engaging way of saying what's going on and giving some insight into what the character is doing or thinking or feeling.
Yeah, see, to me, the dialogue is showing because it's the action, and I enjoy writing the dialogue, and I find that's the way to get the pages turning. And I think with a young reader, you have to get the pages turning.
Yeah.
I'm always my dilemma is, because there's science in my books, is not to bog down in too much detail, because I know, in fact, a kid critiqued my third book. And there's a lot of stuff about DNA technology, and they said it was slow in the middle, and that's where all the information about DNA. And I tried to make it dialogue and in the lab and whatnot, but
right.
It's difficult. You know, science is what I love, and history or mythology or whatever is what you love, and so you don't mind writing about it.
I don't, and that's exactly, it's funny with
but they may mind reading about it.
Right, and with the second book, that's what I was mindful of, because some of the feedback I got was, when I was writing, when I separated away from the character and just did what I called an interlude, and the interlude was just a couple of Greek gods talking or something like that, where some of the feedback I got was like, oh yeah, I really got confused at that point. I couldn't follow who was who, and I know all of the Greek gods are, and I know who the Greek gods' parents were, and cousins and third, you know, nephews and all that stuff. So in the second book, I actually included an appendix, so that without having to go into tremendous detail in the story, in the back, you can look and you can see that Helios is the Greek embodiment of the sun, and Polemos is the Greek embodiment. Like, you don't have to go into, I didn't have to go into tremendous detail in the story because I had the appendix. And that was actually a suggestion I'd been given about the first book, but I didn't feel in the first book it was as necessary. I think in the second book, I allowed myself to really get more in depth with the mythology, and to connect Maya's story to, you know, to elements that, again, if I really wanted to sit there and explain everything about how the Titans were born and then Zeus was this, and
That's a different book.
That's a different book. That's a great book. That could be a great tale of mythology, but that's not a
Right.
contemporary, middle
Right.
grade or
It's not
young
what-
adult
what
fiction.
you're doing here. Why don't you explain to our viewing audience who Icarus is, because not everybody knows.
Sure. Well, Icarus is the boy who flew too close to the sun. And I love telling his story when I'm talking to kids or at a book fair or something, because I always say, and the moral is, but the story of Icarus is that him and his father Daedalus were imprisoned, and they were able to create wings out of feathers and wax and bits of leather straps. And as they were preparing to escape from this prison, Daedalus said to Icarus, "You must listen to me, son. You must not fly too close to the sun, or the sun will melt the wax. You must not fly too close to the water, or the spray of the ocean will weigh down the feathers." Icarus said, "Sure, Dad," whatever, as a kid would. They took off. Daedalus is flying. They're heading for the mainland. They're escaping from this island prison. And he looks, and Icarus is all the way up high in the sky, and he calls to him, "Come down." But Icarus is so enthralled with being able to fly that he doesn't pay attention. The heat of the sun melts the wax, holding the wings together. He plunges into the sea. Now, in my story, he survives to have another adventure, but that's when I always say to the kids, and the moral of the story is, always listen to Mom and Dad, because Daedalus warned him, and he didn't pay
Yes.
attention. So
True.
the boy who flew too close to the sun, he's sometimes called the boy who touched the sky, so... one of my favorite stories when I was a kid of Greek mythology. There was two things that I pulled into the first book. One is the story of Icarus that I always loved, and the other is this poem by William Wordsworth that I always loved as well. So it's in the front of the book, and it's referred to throughout the book a few times. Maya talks about how she had to analyze it on her English final, and then it comes up later. And in the sequel, I did the same thing with a passage from Julius Caesar, where, again, Julius Caesar's, there's a portion of it in the beginning, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war," and then that comes up in the book as well. So, again, and that was always a favorite passage from...
Yeah, and actually, I find that kids love mythology.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know any curriculum where it's taught anymore. It used to be taught in English, but it's, high school English,
Right.
9th grade, I think.
I think sometimes they still can teach it in 6th grade.
Do they?
Depending on the district and, the setup of their whether that's middle school still or whether that's...
So the second book is pretty much on the same theme, the same kind of...
Similar theme. What happened with the second book is that I looked at a lot of the questions that I was asked about the first book, and there were several people, my sister being one of them, who said, "Wait a minute, you left way too many things unanswered here." And I was like, "Well, it's because it's the beginning. It's like I have to, But in the second book, I answered many, if not most, of those questions. And I left a few things out there still, so should I decide to write a third. But if I never decide to write another one, at least the first two together,
Yeah.
it's like The Godfather, Godfather Part 1, Part 2, Godfather Part 3.